Welcome. I'm Father Mitch Pacwa, and welcome to EWTN Live, where we bring you guests around the world. Our guest tonight is a medical doctor and a surgeon. He specializes in dermatology, and at the same time, he's the father of 7. He's also a member of the Catholic Medical Association, and he co-hosts the CMA, that is Catholic Medical Association, weekly radio program called Dr. Doctor, which you can listen to at EWTN.com/radio, as well as going to ondemand.EWTN.com. He has put his medical expertise to work in a brand new book providing up-to-date understanding based on ancient literature, archaeology, and his own insight as a doctor into the physical sufferings and death of our Lord, which of course was during Holy Week, the week that we are celebrating right now. His book is called What Christ Suffered, A Doctor's Journey Through the Passion. So please welcome Dr. Thomas McGovern. Dr. McGovern, how the heaven are you?
This is wonderful to be here live with you, Father.
Yeah, well, see, you're usually in a studio. Where's your radio studio when you do?
Well, we were in a studio till COVID hit in Fort Wayne, Indiana, Redeemer Radio. But then we started to use Zoom, and now we use something called Zencaster from our homes.
Okay.
So actually, earlier this week, we recorded our first show with people in the same room together, and it's a dynamite show this weekend on a COVID survivor who almost died in his young 40s. So I encourage you, please listen. It's a tremendous story.
Great. We'll look forward to that, and that'll be on Dr. Doctor this weekend. Well, wonderful. So it's, you're accustomed to being here in the media, and this is an interesting area. There have been a number of doctors who have taken a look at Christ's suffering.
Yes.
A Doctor at Calvary is one of the most popular books. But that's not your book. What got you into doing this in the first place?
I didn't even know about a Doctor at Calvary when I was in med school. During my first year, I was teaching religious education to fifth graders on Monday nights. And during Lent, that first year, I wanted to teach them something about what our Lord suffered. So somebody encouraged me to go to a professor I had in pathology, Dr. Bill Edwards. They said, I bet he has something on it. So I said, Dr. Edwards, one day after class, do you have any information on what our Lord suffered? He said, come back to me tomorrow after class. I'll have something for you.
By the way, where were you in medical school?
Mayo Clinic, Rochester, Minnesota.
Okay, sure.
And so the next day I go to him after class, Dr. Edwards, did you remember me? And he hands me an article. And I look at the title, On the Physical Death of Jesus Christ. Well, that hits the topic. Then I looked at the date of the article. It was funny. It was the next week. This is in the 80s. How did he have something from the next week? And then I looked at the author.
Maybe Shirley MacLaine.
Maybe. She was in the 80s, wasn't she? Yes. But anyway, he wrote it. It was that famous article in the Journal of the American Medical Association that's still circulating on the internet. So I did my required half year of research with him my junior year. He's a cardiac pathologist. That was the research, but he let me have access to everything that he'd researched, and I started giving multimedia presentations on it for about 20 years. But then I started reading what other researchers had done. It's like, some of this might be wrong, and I stopped giving talks.
And so instead of giving talks, you wrote a book?
What? No, I didn't do anything.
Oh.
But then my friend, who you also know, Dr. Matthew Bunson,
oh, yes.
He encouraged me to write a course for Catholic Distance University on this subject. I said, well, if I do it, I'm going to have to do it right. And this article was written in 2006 in the Royal Society Journal of Medicine. And these two authors said, doctors who have written about this, they've given like 10 different explanations for how Christ died.
Right.
They don't research the history very well. It's just been poorly done. Look, if someone else does it, please do it right. So I took that as my marching orders. They said, here's 5 fundamental flaws with what's been done. I said, I'm going to address every one of those in my book and come clean and say, look, I was wrong about these things. Here's what the evidence shows. Then about 8 years ago, when I got into the Catholic Medical Association, my bishop, Kevin Rhodes, asked me to write a course for medical professionals on suffering. So I use Salva Fici Dolores on the Christian meaning of human suffering.
Which is by?
John Paul II.
Yes.
Saint John Paul II. And so after spending like 100 hours putting that course together, 500 hours with this other course that I wrote for Catholic Institution University, I was like, maybe we can bring the two together. Because so many of the books on Christ and his suffering are just anatomy and physiology. They might stimulate the mind, maybe a little bit the emotions, but not so much the will. I wanted to incorporate practical aspects of how we can suffer better based on what we learn from Jesus' suffering.
See, this is one of the things I hope people will reflect on, not only from your book, but throughout this Holy Week, that going through the narratives of the Passion of Christ, in finding ways in which we can resonate our own suffering with his, is one of the parts of spiritual growth. And so let's take a look at what you've done on this.
My personal favorite part that affected my life the most came after reflecting on Jesus' suffering in the garden. So in the garden, St. Luke says that, he was praying and his sweat became like great drops of blood falling to the ground. To tie this all together, there's 3 high adrenaline events going on with Jesus in the garden. And we experience 2 of them regularly. The first one, of course, is fear. He's afraid of what's going to happen to him in his human body. He's going to suffer greatly. And so your brain releases a lot of adrenaline and your adrenal glands. And that gets us revved up. But then the bloody sweat, to just look at the anatomy of that. Dr. Pierre Barbet, a doctor at Calvary, wrote in 1950, well, the blood vessels burst and the blood cells mix with sweat. There's just too many layers of tissue in there. That doesn't happen. What we've learned that happens because over the last 20 years, there have been like 30 cases where there's pictures, biopsies, and what happens in these people when the blood's oozing from the skin, it's just literally coming out the skin, not mixing with the sweat in the skin, it's mixing on the outside. And we know that if you give somebody a beta blocker, which blocks the effects of adrenaline, because hematidrosis, bloody sweat, is a high adrenaline state, the bleeding stops. But I said there were 3 high adrenaline events. Well, the first is fear. And what we can do with fear and anxiety is we can dwell on it. But Jesus shows us how to transform it into loving action, into what positive psychologists call flow. It's when you're familiar with the term, when we're in the zone, we're fully in the present moment, that sacrament of the present moment. And so transforming the anxiety of adrenaline, instead of seeing something as fearful, see it as not a threat, but an opportunity. And so the first step in doing that is reframing, they call it in psychology. In other words, how can I look at this threat as an opportunity? So at first he's thinking, Father, please let this cup pass from me. But he reframes it. What does he say? Not my will, but yours be done. He decides, that's my opportunity, that's my challenge, that's what the Fathers want. I'm going to take this energy and do that. Then the second step is you experience the feeling of that anxiety, because it's not going to pass by trying to run from it, but by experiencing it. How does he experience it? While he's praying, he experiences it so much that it bleeds out of him. But it does a funny thing. It sends your brain the message, oh, I got the message, there's a threat here. Then your brain calms down. Then you can act in that flow, in that total presence in the moment. And if you look at the Gospels, after this event, it's like he's above all the action. Everything's happening beneath him. It's like they're actors around him, but he's totally in command, totally at peace, totally present with doing the Father's will. And by learning these 3 steps, which I learned from a Catholic psychiatrist from Harvard, Dr. Kevin Majors, I was able to come off of 30 years of anti-anxiety medication. Never thought it was going to be possible. Did it last year during the pandemic. So this is a real thing, being able to transform anxiety, which 20% of the population suffers from, and turn it into an opportunity for growth in virtue, growth in holiness, and loving action.
This is something that, as tomorrow will be a Holy Thursday.
Yes.
And in our churches, we'll celebrate the Mass of the Lord's Supper.
Yes.
And we'll consider the Last Supper and the foot washing. But after Mass, most of our churches reserve the Blessed Sacrament on the side
Yes.
as a way for any and all of us to visit the churches and experience Gethsemane with Christ.
Yes.
As he said to St. Peter, could you not spend an hour with me?
Yes.
And I think this is especially important because the mood in this past year has been one of multiple anxieties.
Yes.
The riots that we had, the election results,
Yes.
the COVID, the sickness, when will the vaccine get here? And lots of anxiety. And a lot of people are living on fear of what could go wrong.
Right.
Instead of, taking time to be with Jesus in Gethsemane.
Yes.
And as you describe it, going into the flow of this
Yes.
experience that is fearful, and people are coming to kill him
Yes.
and torture him.
But then he's at peace.
Exactly.
It's amazing.
At peace and in control.
And it's available to us because adrenaline is somewhat of a superpower, so we can act our best. In fact, I mean, it sounds silly, but if you tell students before they take a test, anxiety means excitement, it's there to help you do better on the test, and you tell another classroom, nothing, the class that you told anxiety is there, this adrenaline is there to help you do better, they actually do better.
Right. And we've heard stories of parents who have witnessed a child in tremendous distress and they found superhuman strength for a moment.
Exactly.
To
Yes.
rescue a child or something. That use of our adrenaline and the anxiety is a positive change of it. And with Jesus, it's so powerful. I urge our folks to take a look at John chapter 18, where in Gethsemane, Jesus is the one who says, whom do you seek?
Yes.
And they say, Jesus Nazareth. And his answer in Greek in particular is, I am. And they fall backwards.
Because that's the divine name.
I've known various criminals and, over the years, in various circumstances. None of them has been able to do anything like that. When they're caught, it's a different kind of response.
Yes.
Christ has that command, and he's there to teach us in our anxiety to get that command. Was that
exactly
one of your points?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, we all want to be our best. We all want to be holy.
Yeah. So go on.
Some of the things that I learned that I taught wrong for years about Jesus was, did he die of suffocation? How much of a role does that play? And it's in Dr. Pierre Barbet's book, A Doctor at Calvary.
Right.
And where did he get this idea that he died of suffocation? Well, it goes back to World War I, actually, when some of the Austrians were using this torture called Aufbinden. What does Aufbinden mean in German?
To bind up, to tie up.
Doesn't Aufbinden mean to untie?
When you add auf, maybe. Yeah.
Okay, so I've been told, I don't speak German.
Yeah.
It means to untie, because they would take and tie people's wrists together and then lift them up so that their feet were off the ground. And in that torture, their muscles would gradually go into spasm. They would contract, and you couldn't relax them. And after half an hour, they'd have trouble breathing. They'd be sweating all over. And if you left them up there long enough, they would die of suffocation because all their muscles would tighten, even their diaphragm. So when Dr. Barbet heard about this, he said, aha, that's what happened on the cross. Well, some of the things I found in my research were fascinating. Number one, there is no religious image of crucifixion till 420 AD, over 100 years after Constantine abolished it. So whoever made those images, their parents, their grandparents, great-grandparents, never saw crucifixion. So we really can't rely on those. There are a couple of graffiti from around 100 and 200 AD when crucifixions were going on. And in those graffiti and in several gemstones with image of Christ crucified, the arms are straight out. Nothing shows the arm straight up. And in fact, the Latin word for the crossbar of the cross is patibulum, which comes from the verb meaning to stretch out. So in all likelihood, crucifixion victims' arms were straight out. They didn't have trouble breathing. And in fact, the whole suffocation theory meant that somebody, their knees are bent on the cross, they would have to be able to straighten up, bring their elbows in, and express air from the lungs. That was part of the theory. Well, when Dr. Frederick Zugabe, who did research in the 80s and 90s with medical students, strapped them to crosses, said, straighten out your bent legs. None of them could do it even once. Yet we know crucifixion victims would live for days on the cross if they weren't otherwise killed. So there's a number.
There are a number of times that they would live for 3 days or so.
Exactly. And plus, Christ cried out in a loud voice at the moment of death. You can't do that if you're suffocating. So that was one of the fascinating things I learned. Another fascinating thing was, the nails through the feet. The first image in religious art of nails going through both feet on the front of the cross is like 900 or 1,000 years after Christ. All the ancient images, the heels are actually to the side of the upright bar. And archaeologists found about a mile or two north of Calvary, an ossuary, a bone box, which was labeled of a young man who's probably in his 20s, judging by the bones, with a nail that went sideways from the outside of the heel bone to the inside, and it had bent, hit a knot, so it was still there. Well, the ancient images fit that. But then in 2018, another skeleton was found in the Po Valley in northern Italy, unmarked grave. And this one, because of the diameter of the hole, there was no nail in there, it went from the inside to the outside. Yet, one of these ancient graffiti shows the knees turned out and nailed from the inside of the heel into the upright post. So it's most likely that the nails went through the heel bone, the calcaneus, but it doesn't break the bone, so that scripture wouldn't be contravened where it says none of his bones were broken.
Okay, see that would be something else that most of us wouldn't be able to observe know as much about the structure of the heel, but that it wouldn't break any bones.
No. And studies have been done like this on cadavers, showing that also to be the case.
Okay, good. And one topic that I frequently hear from people calling in, what about the nail in the hands versus the wrist?
Okay, so in Greek, the word for hand includes both the word for the palm, palame, and the word for wrist, carpus carion. And there's 8 bones in the wrist. And even today, anatomically, in medical school, I learned the wrist is part of the hand. So if I do surgery on somebody's wrist, I have to code it as part of the hand.
And that would also be true in Aramaic and Hebrew. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you. I did not know that. And I know you did. So could the nail have gone through the palms? Well, it could have, because the arms were horizontal. They weren't bearing much weight. Almost all the weight was borne on the feet. But I was a soldier. I was in the Army for 8 years. Thinking like a soldier, soldiers never do anything in a more complicated fashion than necessary to get it done. Also, the Shroud of Turin here has one wound that shows it, a nail coming in or the back of the wrist. And then Dr. Pierre Barbet did research on some cadaver arms, and every time he pounded a nail anywhere near the middle of the wrist, it always found its way through the same 4 bones without breaking them. Then you go to the ancient images. All the ancient images show the wrist closer to the crossbar than the palms. None of them show the palm near the crossbar. So in all likelihood, patibulum means to stretch out. Soldiers would have stretched him out, one on either end when he's lying on the ground. And one would nail one in, the other one would then stretch it and nail the other one in. Then they put him on the upright post, which was inevitably there. There's no evidence anywhere in history that anyone ever carried a 2-part cross. How big was the cross Jesus carried? And who told us Jesus carried his cross? If you listened to Mark this last weekend in the Passion, what does it say? It says they pressed Simon of Cyrene into service to carry his cross. Matthew, Mark, and Luke don't tell us that Jesus carried his cross. Only John does. And how big was it? Pierre Barbet said, 75 to 100 pounds. Based on what? When I looked, there was no reference. So I couldn't find a reference anywhere. So all I thought about, and you can tell me how reputable this would be. I've been in the Church of Santa Croce in Jerusalem in Rome.
Right.
It's a church with a number of relics from the Passion that St. Helena brought back in the late 320s, around 330 AD. And she was thought to have found the crossbar of Dismas, the good thief. And that crossbar is there. It's 6 feet long, about 5 by 2.5 inches, made of European black pine. Well, which all the relics of the Holy Cross that have been tested are also made of European black pine. And it would weigh about 15 pounds. But at this point, Jesus had lost so much blood and hadn't had anything to drink. He lost the blood from the scourging, some from the hematidrosis. It's hot. He's been up all night. So he's going to teeter. So if you've got something 6 feet long across your shoulders, it's really easy to lose your balance and fall.
Sure.
Like we believe that he did. So the crossbar didn't have to weigh a lot to bring him literally to his knees.
Right, right. And that's an important thing, and for a number of reasons, because you even have some folks, mostly from the Kingdom Hall of the Jehovah's Witnesses, who say that it wasn't a cross, that's a pagan symbol the church invented.
Right.
It was an upright stake.
Yes, the torture stake.
Yeah, torture stake. That there's no evidence.
There's no evidence for that, and there's abundant evidence going back to about 490 BC that it was always a two-part cross.
Right.
And interestingly,
in Roman crucifixion, I think in some of the Mesopotamian, it was usually impalement.
correct, which was completely different.
Very different. So then it would be an upright post in Mesopotamia, but they would put the pole through and it'd come out your chest.
Yeah, completely different. Sometimes it was called a suspension punishment. So there was a larger group called suspension that would include even hanging, crucifixion, something called exposure, even that the Greeks did.
Yeah.
But this was different. And then with the scourging, something I learned is that in Dr. Edwards' article, again, my mentor at Mayo, the article has a scourge drawn with little pieces of sharp bone on these leather straps, along with pieces of lead. Well, as I found out, only the Greeks used the sharp pieces of bone, but the Romans routinely used the little lead balls. And in fact, scourges have been found in the catacombs, and they're metal chain handle with little metal chains going off that at the end each have a pair of these little lead balls, maybe 3/8 of an inch in diameter, which matches up with the Shroud of Turin. There are no scratch marks on the Shroud of Turin like pieces of bone would have done, but there are a number of these round marks where the scourge would have drawn blood. So we see evidence of hundreds of strikes, and yet that's only a portion of them, because wherever the scourge struck and didn't draw blood, there's no mark on the shroud.
Interesting.
And in antiquity, scourging was a preliminary for crucifixion, but most often the victims were scourged as they were carrying their cross. We know that wasn't the case with Jesus, and we know further, if we look in Luke's gospel, it suggests that Pilate wanted the scourging to be the entirety of the punishment and then release him.
Right.
Which may explain why the scourging was more severe, and then Jesus died more rapidly than he expected with the crucifixion.
Yeah, because Pilate was even surprised at how quickly he died.
Yes.
So folks understand, the people living in the Holy Land were well familiar with crucifixions.
Indeed.
There had been a revolt of zealots when Christ was very, very young.
Yes,
Up in the north, and they were crucified. And then, of course, later on, after the Jewish revolt of 66 to 72, there were tens of thousands of people
in
crucified.
fact, Flavius Josephus writes about it in the Wars of the Jews. Flavius Josephus had been a Jewish general, saw which way the wind was blowing, and went over to the Roman side as a traitor, wrote about it, and he said in 70 AD that they were crucifying sometimes hundreds of Jews a day, one after one way, one after another, in ways of jest. So there were multiple positions they were even putting people in when there were those mass crucifixions. They weren't all exactly the same way.
Right. And this is, which is a horrible suffering for all those folks. So we've got, he's not dying by asphyxiation.
Right.
And what would you then say is the cause of death?
You know, based on the readings of numerous experts, everyone seems to agree that a major role was played by shock, traumatic shock. Shock, blood pressure drops, you don't have enough blood flowing to the organs to feed it the oxygen and the blood sugar it needs to stay alert. So if you've lost 10, 20% of your blood supply, say, and you're upright, gravity is going to take a lot of it down, you're going to get lightheaded, your tongue's going to stick to the roof of your mouth, your lips are going to stick together, you're going to be cool and clammy skin because it's going to take the blood internally and not from the skin. And so shock is just due to the loss of blood because you're losing it externally, but also internally with the scourging. The scourging would have caused bleeding inside the cavity between the lungs and the chest wall, the pleural space. Therefore, the lungs can't expand that much. And you even have some bleeding within the lung tissue itself. So it won't be as efficient in getting the oxygen, which you need more and more as you are in pain. So you get into this vicious circle, then you can't expand your lungs to get in a big breath of air because it hurts. After the scourging, all those bones and cartilage, even though not broken, are tenderized. So,
and again, people who have had serious bruises to their chest cavity, they run into a wall or something. It may not be a broken rib, but they feel that sensitivity that comes with.
Right, they hold themselves like this so they don't expand their lungs too much with a big deep breath.
Right.
So you start to build up acid in the blood, and then this will lead eventually to affecting the heart muscle. So if the heart muscle isn't beating with its normal pacemaker, but at the bottom of the heart, the ventricle, the big thick wall of the heart will start to drive it, and it does it very fast, maybe 200 beats a minute. And when that happens, ventricular tachycardia, you feel something different in your awareness. You feel like you're going. So Christ would have known naturally, not supernaturally, naturally that's the end was near, so that he could cry out, it is finished, into your hands I commit my spirit.
Right.
So it was probably a combination of this traumatic shock due to blood loss and fluid loss, leading to an abnormal heart rhythm, and then death. That is the most likely.
Yeah, that would be something that a person can feel a certain amount of draining, and lightheadedness.
And maybe even palpitations.
Yeah. I had a heart attack 5 years ago, and that certainly was one of the feelings.
Oh my! Yeah, I'm glad you're still with us.
Yeah. The EMT has said to me, "Father, you're having the widowmaker." And I said, well, that's not possible. I've never been married. He said,
good answer.
No time to joke. But it was my heart attack. But I do recall that kind of feeling. And you say, okay, and you just don't know.
Right.
Obviously I lived. But this is part of the experience that Christ would have. It is an experience that people feel, and I don't know what others feel, but they seem to indicate as they're dying. I've been with a number of dying people, of course, over the years, and they seem to have that kind of experience that they're losing and that they're draining away. So, one last question, because we'll be having to go to a break fairly soon, but when the heart is pierced by the lance.
Yes.
Tell us what's going on there.
So the thinner side of the heart is the right side. And on the Shroud of Turin, it looks like the spear went through from the right. So that's the wall it would have pierced, a thinner wall. Now there would have been fluid that had settled out. So even if there was blood in the fluid, the blood cells would have gone to the bottom, clear fluid on top. When the spear goes in, it would have gone into the right atrium or ventricle, we're not sure which, but thin enough that the blood in there could go along the lance. The blood doesn't clot in the body as soon as somebody dies. It'd still be liquid. And you'd see that blood flow out, and then a little bit of the clear fluid from the pleural space between the lungs and the chest wall. Thus the blood and water that flowed from the side of Christ.
Yeah. And, of course, we try to understand that both spiritually, and St. John says he's an eyewitness.
Yes.
And that he saw this. It's not something he heard in the paper. He wasn't watching television news programs. So he's an eyewitness and describes that, and it makes good medical sense.
Yes.
We want to let you know to check out EWTN.com/Holy Week. We have a lot of celebration of this week because this is our week as Christians. This is the most important spiritual week of the year for us. Our redemption is being celebrated. So it's EWTN.com/Holy Week. And check out the different programs we have. Hopefully you'll enjoy them as well. We need to take a break right now, but we'll be back in a couple of minutes. And we'd like to get your questions and your comments. So please stay with us. All right, we are discussing a book entitled What Christ Suffered, A Doctor's Journey Through the Passion by Dr. Thomas W. McGovern, MD. This book is available at EWTNRC.com, where it is book item number 5769. 5769. So, hopefully you'll get a hold of that and use it for your own meditation. You ready for some questions?
I'd love it.
Let's start off with Celine. Celine, where are you calling from?
I'm calling from right here in Birmingham area.
Wonderful, Celine, wonderful. And what is your question?
It's not a question, it's a comment. I'm thrilled to be able to call in because I'm a huge fan of Dr. Doctor, and especially the episodes on anxiety with Dr. Kevin Majors. And I couldn't believe that Dr. McGovern started the show tying what I've learned there into the agony in the garden. And it's good inspiration to think of, to meditate on. And I just wanted to encourage the EWTN viewers to check out Dr. Doctor.
Well, I appreciate the advertisements, Celine. I appreciate it. Yeah, it's had a big impact on my life. And, you know, much of the book is actually about how to practically address suffering. We didn't even go into that. But that's what I really like. Even more than that, just, you know, how to suffer better. So pick it up, because I think, you know, some people, my wife likes the anatomy and physiology best. Doug Keck today said he liked the maps and showing how close everything was. Yeah. Other people like the spiritual reflection. So I hope there's something for everyone.
Yeah. I think that Gethsemane is oftentimes under meditated. You know, this deserves a lot of reflection. I oftentimes think about Gethsemane as a place where Christ's suffering heals those who've been through divorce or abandonment by their parents, or by children, or by friends, because it's there that he's betrayed with a kiss.
Oh, yes.
And so many folks, you know, go through that in divorce. It's and to take your experience of that divorce or other family disruption, where your parents just leave you, or maybe never know them, or your children abandon you, just leave you alone, sometimes even hate you. To be with Jesus in that moment and let what he went through be the source of healing for that is very important.
And along those lines, one of the things I learned in my research on suffering is there's a mysterious verse St. Paul wrote in Colossians 1:24.
Yes.
I make up in my flesh what is lacking in the sufferings of Christ. It's like, when you see what happened, what could possibly be lacking? But I'm researching what John Paul has said about it, and others, is that what was lacking is that Jesus only suffered, died, and rose in the body he received through the womb of the Virgin Mary. He wants to suffer, die, and rise in each one of us.
Exactly.
So with what you're saying, it's not just, it's suffering with him in you. I mean, the best quote I learned during the pandemic is from Paul Claudel. And that is, Jesus did not come into the world to remove suffering. He didn't even come into the world to explain suffering. He came into the world to suffer with us and in us.
Yes. And, you know, in a recent book I did called Wheat and Tares, I make meditations on the priest abuse scandal in light of the apostles and their failures being like that of the priests' failures and bishops' failures, the suffering of Christ related to the suffering of the victims of the abuse and their families, and to find in his passion the source of healing for the very profound pain and betrayals that people have experienced. We can do this not only for that kind of situation, but for so many of the other circumstances that we're in.
Yes.
I have another caller. Hello, Mark.
Yes, Father Mitch. How are you?
Fine. Where are you calling from?
I'm calling from Pennsylvania, northeastern Pennsylvania.
Wonderful. Thank you. And what is your question?
I was always curious about the use of the word "read" in the accounts of the of the crucifixion. I was never sure what a reed was.
Great question.
I've heard it referred to as a walking stick of the time, or and maybe about the size of a small baseball bat. Can you clarify what a reed is?
That's a great question, because growing up near the shores of Lake Michigan, I always pictured it, what we called reeds were like the cattails that grew along the lake, really flimsy. No, there's this plant that grows in the Middle East, the name is Arundodonax, and it makes these rods which are kind of like bamboo. And each one, I think of a billiard cue stick for pools. It's like that. And so when we talk about the crown of thorns being probably a cap more than a circle, it says that Jesus was beaten on the head with the reed. Well, what was in between his head and the reed was the crown of thorns. So this reed, which is like a pool cue stick, is actually pounding that more into the scalp. Incredibly painful, because the surface of bone has a lot of little nerve endings that can feel pain.
Yeah. So, and if you go, you don't see those reeds in too many places around Jerusalem today, but there would have been some marshy areas around in the past. But if you go down by the Jordan River, there's an area there, just a lot of them, and you can see them quite commonly there, especially on the Jordanian side more than on the Israeli side. All right, we have another caller. Hello, Tony?
Yes, Father Mitch. Happy Easter for my wife and I.
Thank you. Where are you calling from?
Florida, sir.
Wonderful. Thank you. And what's your question today?
Well, I know that Jesus suffered a lot on the cross, and it's basically for you and the doctor, if you know, with your wisdom. My father suffered as well, and I was wondering if he suffered all the way up until his death, or was he didn't feel anything, between the time he died. I can't get it out right. But
well, how would this be? Let me just make sure I understand what you're asking. Are you asking about what point does a dying person stop feeling physical pain?
You got it, Father Mitch, perfectly. You must have went to Loyola.
I'm not sure that's why, but you explained. I think I got what you were saying. So good. At least the two of us can communicate.
When does the pain stop? If you know, Or have you heard anybody that, like you said, you possibly had a heart attack and do you feel any pain? Or is it just, my father didn't suffer at all, or he did suffer? I know he was suffering, but it seemed like he had no pain at the end when he was semi-conscious.
Okay.
I think you just answered the question. I think the degree of consciousness is often related to the pain, but also remember that the body, especially in the brain, makes its own natural painkillers when the body is under attack. So it's really hard to know how much each individual person is feeling at any given time. There's endorphins and kephalins and other chemicals that the body makes. I've talked to people who said, wow, you must be suffering a lot. And they'll tell me, no, I really am not feeling any pain. So it's so hard to know. I can't give a definitive answer for your father.
That's been my experience, and again, with people I've visited in the hospitals and such, that the threshold of pain for each individual varies quite a bit.
Yes.
Some people can really deal with an enormous amount of pain, and others not as much, because of their nerves, and there's a variance in the ratio of how the nerves are felt. I think about people who are hearing impaired and become more sensitive to sight.
Correct.
And people who are sight impaired become more sensitive to sound.
Yes.
And it seems that the ratio of sensitivity can shift in a person.
Certainly.
Does that fit?
Yes,
medicine?
that fits, and especially what he said about the level of consciousness. I mean, the less conscious you are, the less you're going to be experiencing and remembering that experience of pain.
Yeah, yeah. And certainly I've been with people who are cancer patients and such, who had experienced a lot of pain, but as they moved into the act of dying, they seemed to relax. They seem, some of them, really die very peacefully, quietly. Others, on the other hand, and I've talked to folks who work in hospice, they'll also say some people who have various psychological and spiritual issues going on can die with great anxiety.
Yes.
They really notice religious people from loving families die more calmly.
Oh, yes, that's true.
Yeah, I'm sure you've seen that.
Actually, as a dermatologist, I've never seen a patient die.
Now there's an endorsement. That's an endorsement. But I'm sure you've been around dying patients in hospitals.
Yes,
in the
yes,
past.
I have, but not at the moment of death.
Good. Now, here's something else. There's the New Testament describes a lot of pain, and a lot of it was on a psychological level. For instance,
certainly,
when I was writing this book, I believe I counted 6 different times soldiers were mocking him.
Oh, people don't remember what happened after the Garden of Gethsemane before Friday morning. He was taken to the house of Caiaphas, which today is a Dominican monastery, St. Peter in Gallicantu, which means cock crow, because that's where the cock crowed and Peter had denied he knew Jesus. Well, there's this pit there, and there is an ancient tradition in the Holy Land that Jesus was also scourged there, but with a different implement, probably a switch. And there are even marks on the Shroud of Turin, which would, make sense of, small sticks being used against him.
Yeah.
But the Gospels tell us he was struck with fists, with sharp blows, he was spit upon, prophesy, tell us which one hit you. And then Luke uses another Greek word, well, you'll know this, derantes, D-E-R, which is the same prefix as dermatology or dermis or skin. And it used to have a meaning of an especially harsh beating of the flesh. And then he was kept awake in this pit beneath the house, perhaps tied to another column, which is still venerated in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in the Catholic chapel.
That's right. That's right. You can see that column at the Holy Sepulchre. The Greeks have a chapel, the Catholics have a chapel, the Armenians have a chapel.
Yes.
And then, of course, they share the Holy Sepulchre and Calvary.
Yes.
But in the Catholic chapel, you can see that pillar.
Yes.
It's in a little niche
Yes.
of its own, about the height of the tabernacle. And the Greeks also have, I don't know if you made the stations of it's not the stations of the cross, it's the stations inside the Holy Sepulchre.
Yes.
And they do that every day.
Yes.
And there's also a round drum stone from a pillar where Christ was seated for the crowning of thorns.
I've seen the pillar. I didn't know what the significance was.
Yeah, and it's also in glass. So there are a number of instruments that are there.
And one thing that people don't think about, the breaking of the legs. That was another thing in support of the theory of suffocation. They said, they won't be able to push themselves up, the legs are broken. Well, leg breaking was actually a standalone punishment in the Roman Empire, and it probably led to death because when you break your leg bone, your tibia, you'll lose a liter of blood if you just break one, 2 liters if you break 2, and up to 4 liters if you break them and they're sticking out through the skin. And the average adult man might have 6 liters. So that's more than enough to kill somebody rapidly.
Yeah. See, that's, and they wanted them down by the end of by sundown. They would take them off the crosses because Jewish law did not allow anybody to hang dead on a cross overnight.
Correct.
And by the way, just so some people might have heard this theory, there was one, he's a New Testament scholar, former priest, but he said that the Christ body had probably been thrown to the garbage dump and eaten by dogs. And I find that very odd from a scholar.
Yes.
Because in the Mishnah, that is specifically prohibited. You may not do that. Mishnah, for those who don't know, Mishnah is a collection of rabbinic sayings that were organized into tractates and provide an important basis for the tradition of Jewish law. It's well worth reading. But it specifically says you cannot do that. You can't throw a body on a garbage dump and let dogs eat it. Maybe in some places they did that, but in Jewish places they had too much respect for the dead, and that would not have been done.
And the Romans would give in to local customs wherever they could.
Yeah,
that was why they had such a large empire, because they didn't impose top down any heavier than needed.
Yep. You have another caller. Hello, Elizabeth?
Yes.
Hi,
hello.
where are you calling from?
From New York, upstate New York.
Wonderful. And what is your question?
Well, I had a question for the doctor, and I had a question for you, Father.
I see.
My question for you, Father, was somewhere it is written in the Bible, I believe, that Jesus said, I left you a portion of suffering so that I would not be ashamed to call you my friends. And I was wondering if you knew where that was, because that's always been very touching to me, that he lets us suffer, allows us to co-suffer with him as, because we become close to somebody when we suffer with them.
I don't recall that being in the Gospels.
No.
Nor in the epistles. So I'm
Would
not
it be
sure.
St. Faustina's writings?
Yeah, it might be there. But doctor, what about the doctor's question?
And the question for the doctor is, I had heard at one time that Jesus died of a broken heart, and that when a human being, people do die of a broken heart, when that happens, that the blood and water separates in the heart. And
yep.
I was wondering if that was true.
There's a cardiomyopathy. I think my cardiologist friend Dave says Takotsubo's cardiomyopathy, and people can die of a heart muscle breaking, but it typically means that there's been a heart attack, and that the heart muscle has had a time to weaken and die, and that would take hours to days instead of minutes to happen. So the time course doesn't fit. It's incredibly poetic, but the evidence medically is that it couldn't have happened that way.
Yeah. I'm not sure that would be the way to think of it. Now, again, poetically, you can see that, but even heartbreak. I think the point that you made before about our Lord staying in command of the situation is fairly important to remember. That he was very much in command, and you see it that as the soldiers and the crowd mock him, he's able to speak, "Father, forgive them.
Yes.
They know not what they do." He not only forgives, but gives an excuse.
Yes, ignorance.
Yeah, and I'll plead that one often. But also the other statements on the cross, like the forgiveness of the good thief.
Yes.
The conversation between Our Lady and St. John.
Yes.
That this indicates a certain self-presence, self-command that is not...
I wouldn't think of saying those things if I were in that position.
No.
That's amazing.
No. And this is something that we can also spiritually learn from. Again, that's part of the point of your book, is to draw some of the spiritual elements from this. And when things look like they're going very badly, like being crucified, and your mother watching, as any parent knows how horrible that would be. But he's able to communicate deeper issues and maintain that sense. And we ought to also ask, as we go through crises, traumas, as we approach death, to, as you said, ease into this, be with it, and be present in that moment, feel the pain, and don't try to deny it. Don't you enter into it, but be able to be present in a way that the Lord can use your pain.
I think
for the sake of others.
We may regret that we didn't do more with our suffering after we have died. One of the best things that I learned about suffering is a mental block right now. Where did it we have a superpower. That's it. We're all baptized as priest, prophet, and king. Part of the essence of priesthood is to offer sacrifice for the salvation of somebody else. So we have that ability united to Christ. We can offer our sacrifices on behalf of others' redemption. St. John Paul writes that. This is better than any Marvel superhero superpower. I mean, that little 3-word phrase, offer it up, it's real. And so I encourage people, start your day. That's the way I start my day. My God, I will accept and bear with submission today whatever suffering you send me for love of you, conversion of sinners, and reparation for sins. And so I've just reframed my day. My day is an opportunity to do that.
I've done a program in the past with one of my Jesuit brothers on the morning offering.
Yes.
These are what we do. We offer our sufferings as well as our joys.
Yes.
It's very important. But I'm afraid we're running out of time. That we have to offer up to.
We do.
Again, the book is called What Christ Suffered, A Doctor's Journey Through the Passion by Dr. Thomas McGovern. Get it at EWTNRC.com. And it is item number 5769. Also check out EWTN.com/Holy Week to know when the different ceremonies and services are being offered over the next few days. Doctor, I really appreciate it. I know it's bad weather today and difficult travel, but thank you for joining us. And may the Lord bless you and keep you, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. We want to wish you all a blessed Holy Week and a blessed celebration of the resurrection. We thank you for your support, ask you to keep on supporting us, and we'll keep on bringing as many of these programs as we can to help strengthen your faith and draw you ever closer to Jesus Christ our Lord. God bless you all, and thank you.